Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to show you how to update the firmware on your Fuji camera, as well as give you 3 reasons why you should actually be upgrading and keeping your camera firmware up to date. Now, if you own a Fuji X series camera like the Fuji X-T4, X-T3, or any of the other X series cameras, and you aren't keeping your camera's firmware upgraded, you may be missing out on a number of features that your camera may offer. Firmware is essentially the software that you're operating your camera on, and it's responsible for many of the features as well as the functionality of your camera. Camera hardware such as the processor and the image sensor, typically get the most attention in a lot of the YouTube videos that you see, but they wouldn't do much without the firmware software that controls your camera. Now, before we get started on how to update the firmware on your camera, I'm just going to go through and show you and let you know 3 reasons why keeping your camera's firmware up to date is important. Now, first, you'll want to update your firmware to fix different problems in your is just like updating your mobile phone or computer. It's just part of the basic maintenance you should keep on your camera. Now, with your camera, it has different bug fixes that are implemented through your different firmware updates, and they're essential to make sure your camera is working properly. When cameras are first released, sometimes there are small little bugs or problems with functionality, and Fuji as a company actually works quite quickly to release these firmware updates to fix these issues. If you were to use your camera without upgrading, it can sometimes be frustrating a little bit. There'll be some little quirks that sometimes just don't work properly. A bit of a frustrating experience because what you're trying to do just might not work right. Over time, Fuji has released firmware fixes that they fix many issues, both small and big. Taking the time to upgrade your camera ensures that it's working properly and it's up to its full potential. Now, you'll also want to update your firmware to take advantage of new features. Firmware updates to fix bugs are important, absolutely, but Fujifilm also offers another important, and these are some more exciting reason to upgrade your firmware, and that is new features that they'll add to cameras. Now, as Fujifilm engineers develop new features, they will release them into new cameras, but they also release them via firmware updates. Things like autofocus improvements, new film simulations, upgraded video features, autofocus, custom settings. There's just a few of the features that Fuji have released throughout different firmware updates of their cameras. Now, when a new feature is developed, it's generally released to all of the Fuji cameras that they offer that have the hardware capable of handling these new features. Fuji has been known to announce a new camera, much like the X-T4, which is one of the latest X series cameras, and then turn around and release significant updates and new features that are on the X-T4 to the previous generations of cameras with a firmware update. Like, for example, the recent X-T3 firmware update version 4 is a great example of this. This update improved the autofocusing performance of the X-T3 right up to the same level as the X-T4. The firmware update boosted the autofocus speed, the camera's autofocus tracking performance, and also the face and eye autofocus. The update brought new life to the X-T3 camera, making a great camera even better. Now, you'll also want to update firmware for compatibility with new hardware. When Fuji releases new hardware such as lenses or teleconverters or grips, the firmware is needed to be updated to allow you to run this new hardware on your camera. So the camera software works together with this hardware, and if you're running the latest version of the firmware, both the camera and lens, for example, will work at their optimum level, and you will not have, hopefully, any problems. Now, on to how to update the firmware on a Fujifilm camera. So updating your camera's firmware is actually a very simple process. We've done it a few times in other videos on this channel, but we'll walk you through it in this one. And this is the walkthrough for the X-T4, but it's worth noting that upgrading your camera's firmware will be exactly the same no matter what model of X series camera you have. The only difference is some of these videos where I'm showing the demonstration is like the location of the buttons on your camera might be a little bit different. So consult the manual. It's also important to note that Fuji releases firmware updates for their lenses as well as cameras. Now, lens updates aren't released as often as camera updates, but they are just as important and Fujifilm does occasionally release autofocus updates to the lenses, so it's important to keep your lenses up to date as well as cameras. And lenses also sometimes require actually a firmware update to work with newly released cameras as well. So it's worth keeping both up to date and making sure you're up to date on both lens, cameras, accessories. And the process for updating lenses is essentially the same as updating the camera, which you'll see. Now, step one is to check the current firmware version of your camera. And the first step to updating the firmware in your Fuji camera is to check what your current version of firmware you are running on your camera. Now, to check the current version, simply you want to do is turn on your camera while pressing down and holding the display back button. The screen will display the current version of software for both the camera and the lens that is attached to your camera. Now it will ask you if you want to update, but for now, we're not quite at that step yet. So you can just go exit out of this menu or turn off your camera. Step two is to check for updates. Now, once you know what version of firmware is running on your camera and lens that you're currently operating, you'll want to go over to Fuji's website to see what the current version actually is. I will leave a link down below to the Fuji website that will link you and show you all of the X series camera and lenses firmware, and there'll be a complete list of current firmware versions for all of the cameras. Fuji updates are designed so that you can always jump straight to the current version of the firmware. You don't need to go back, for example, and do all of the firmware in between each one. You can always just download the latest current firmware. So for example, if your camera is running version 1 and then current firmware is version 4, you can install the current 4 version and your camera will be completely up to date. Now, step number 3, make sure your camera is charged. You want to charge your camera, and we're going to be preparing an SD card. So before upgrading firmware, it's essential that your camera battery is fully charged. Just like other electronic devices like your cellular phone, if your battery dies, what's going to happen is the camera will shut off during the firmware update, and the camera may no longer operate correctly in some cases. Now, in addition to a fully charged battery, you'll want to have an SD card. The size of the SD card, it will depend on what the size of the update is, but generally, the updates are fairly small, so any SD card will generally work for you. You'll want to format the card inside the camera first. To format, go to the card to the user settings in the camera menu and format the card that way before loading the update onto the card. Just make sure that if you have pictures on your card that you've backed them up, because if you're formatting the card, it's going to erase everything. And step 4 is to download the update onto your SD card. When you click the firmware download button from the Fuji website, you can either download the software onto your computer, or if you have the SD card plugged into your computer, you can download it, save it right onto the SD card if it's attached. If your computer doesn't have a SD card reader directly in that, you might have to get a separate USB connector to connect the USB to your computer. And step 5, install the firmware update. Now we're going to take our camera again with your full battery. You're going to want to put the SD card containing the firmware update into your camera. You insert the SD card into the camera, and then you turn the camera on again while pressing and holding the display back button down. This is just like we did earlier. The camera will prompt if you want to update either the camera or the lens. Since we're going to be updating the firmware of the software here of the camera, you select whichever one you want to do. In this case, it's going to be firmware for the camera. You click OK, you confirm that the update, and it will begin automatically. The size of the update will determine how long it takes for the firmware to install, but usually it doesn't take more than a few minutes. You'll see a progress bar that goes across showing that the firmware is installing. Now make sure you leave your camera alone while it is updated. You do not want to turn off your camera during a firmware upgrade process. And when the update is complete, the camera will tell you that it's finished. You can then go ahead and turn off your camera. It's now up to date with all of the latest firmware. You will want to reformat the memory card just to delete the firmware on there, and it will free up some space on your card so you're able to take more pictures. Now, if you have any questions about the firmware update process on your Fuji X series camera, let me know down below in the comments. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to give me a thumbs up. It lets me know you like the video. I will keep creating more videos just like this. And if you aren't already, please consider subscribing if you aren't following along. Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope this was helpful. I'll see you in the next video.